Hello, I'm Alexia, and let me help you to take the fear out of birth with a mix of real-life positive birth stories and birthing experts sharing their wisdom. I'll also be sharing techniques for getting into the fearless birthing mindset. And join the Fearless Momship community for bonus podcast episodes, access to free birth preparation downloads, and loads more stuff to help you to prepare for a positive birth. Join today at fearfreechildbirth.com. Hello and welcome back to the Fear Free Childbirth podcast. This is me, your host, Alexia Leachman. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, today's episode is really, really important. I am speaking to somebody all about the pelvic floor. Now, I'm telling you this as someone who's come out the other end and tried to go trampolining. So when I tell you that it's really important, I mean it. Anyway, today's chat is brilliant. But before I go into today's chat, because I've got a brilliant guest on, I just have a little few things I just want to update you on. Now, if you heard last week's episode, you'll know I gave a big shout out to Nina, who was battling some challenging healthcare professionals in Japan who were pressuring her for an induction. Well, she was listening to last week's episode and she heard my shout out and it got her all tearful. And then she had to stop listening to the podcast because labour kicked off. And she ended up having an amazing, really fast, wonderful birth. So that is what happened last week. That is the power of the podcast. So I was thrilled to get that news from Nina. She jumped into the Facebook group to update us on how things went. So thank you, Nina. I hope that all is going well with your new little one. Now, I've also got something, a special deal for my listeners, actually. If you're based in the UK, you will know that this weekend it's Mother's Day. Now, as a mother, obviously this is very, very nice, and I might get a card or something like that. I don't know. But also, as someone who doesn't have a mother, I also find it very, very difficult. And so it's a bit of a mixed weekend for me, to be perfectly honest. And so I thought, well, rather than dwelling on my own sorrow and wallowing in my own pity, I just want to sort of focus on other people instead. So I've decided I'm going to offer 5 lucky people half price fear clearance session that's got to be taken in the next week because I just want to focus on helping other people instead of my own stuff. So if you are subscribed to my list, if you receive my emails, then there'll be a special deal in the email that I'll be sending out this week. It'll be going out on Friday. So if you've listened to it today, it'll be going out on Friday. So listen out for that. And if you have some fear clearance work that you want doing, then I'm going to be giving away only 5 spots, but they'll be half price. And that's so that I can just focus on other people to get me through the weekend. But then I thought, hang on, if I'm going to be doing this, why don't I just extend it? So also, if you're up for just doing that work yourself and you want to use the head trash clearance method, then I'm going to offer a 50% discount on my head trash clearance method course. Now, the head trash clearance method is the big method, the method that I use for all my fear clearance, and it's part of the Fearless Birthing Academy. But the Fearless Birthing Academy is currently closed because I'm not taking enrolments at the moment. But if you are really up for doing this work yourself, you've got some fears that you want to clear, you're not really sure that a one-to-one session is what you want, and you just want to do it yourself, then I'll be offering a 50% discount on that. It's normally $197 and you can get it for half price. So all the deets and the links and all that good stuff is going to be in the newsletter that's going out on Friday this week, which will be straight after the launch of the podcast. So if that's what you want, if you're really up for doing this work, and the reason I'm doing this is to sort of take away from my own complicated emotions that happen every year around Mother's Day, but also because to be a great mother, you need to have worked on your stuff. And so this is my way of preparing the mothers of tomorrow to be amazing mothers. So if that's what you want, then come and find the details on the email that will be going out. If you want to join the email list, you can do that at the homepage of fearfreechildbirth.com. Just join the community, which is a big drop down that appears, and you will be added to the list and you will get the details. Okay, now back to today's episode. Today, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm talking about pelvic floors. Now, this is so important. This is so important, and I should have done a lot more during both my pregnancies and following my pregnancies, and I didn't, and I am now giving myself a bit of a smack on the back of the hand. But today I'm speaking to Anita Lambert. Now, Anita is from Toronto in Canada. She was a big fan of the podcast. She listened to it. She's recently got a little one who's over a year now. Anyway, so yeah, way too long. We've been in touch because she was emailing me during her pregnancy. She started listening before her pregnancy as well because she works a lot with pre and postnatal women. So it's been very useful for her in terms of her work. And then it was useful for her pregnancy. So today's episode is actually a 2-in-1 episode, if I'm perfectly honest, because Anita starts by sharing with us her positive birth story. And then she goes on to tell us all about the pelvic floor stuff, how you can prepare during pregnancy, what you can do in terms of preparing for your birth, there's some special checks that you can do before you're even pregnant, and there's also another one that you need to do just before the birth, which I just didn't know anything about. And then she also shares some really great exercises that you can do after birth as well. So really, Anita is sharing a ton of really great information, and it's also really good for those that maybe are listening that have had babies and you're, for some reason, you're still listening to the podcast and you're thinking, I really should, like me, should have done those pelvic floor exercises. Now I can't go trampolining because obviously trampolining is at the top of everyone's list. Well, it is when you have a 4-year-old, believe me. And so now you're thinking, what can I do? Is it too late? So Anita spills the beans on all this stuff, and it's really, really interesting. Really certainly helped me to understand it a lot better. So here's the time that I spoke to Anita. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to switch my microphone on from the desktop one to the proper big nice microphone I have. So I sound like I'm in a fishbowl. So I really have to apologise. Thankfully, Anita's doing most of the talking, not me. But that's why I sound a little bit weird during this podcast. Anyway, here is the time I spoke to Anita all about the pelvic floor. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Anita, to the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you on because we were in touch while you were pregnant as a listener on the podcast. And then, now here we are. Your little one is, I can't believe, 13 months old. So that is
I know.
But also your work is something that's absolutely relevant to pregnant women. So this is why you're on the podcast, sharing your story, but also sharing your work. So I'll give a bit of a clue before I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, but it's basically about pelvic floors, ladies. So, Anita, just tell us a little bit more about who you are and, a little bit more about what you do as well.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a new mom to my daughter who's 13 months. And so I'm a pelvic floor and orthopedic physiotherapist. So I see women mainly through the stages of preparing for pregnancy, during pregnancy, and postpartum, to help prevent and resolve so many of these common pelvic floor and core issues that we hear about from friends, from our moms, from our grandma's generation. And we're kind of told that this is kind of what is just part of becoming a mom or being a mom. And that seeing a pelvic floor physio means that you don't actually have to deal with these, and you can actually put steps in place to try to prevent them. So things like leaking and, as Alexia, as you mentioned earlier when we were chatting, jumping on a trampoline and leaking, which is a really common issue women come in with. Also prolapse. So if any of the pelvic organs start to lower, that can be a common issue. Diastasis, which is a abdominal separation, which can commonly happen during pregnancy and can even stay afterwards. Back pain, pelvic pain. There's so many issues that so many women are just told, it's just kind of part of the deal. And so I just want women to know that it's not, and there's lots that you can do about it.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to dive into all that in a little bit more detail. But first of all, because, and just from a selfish perspective, I want to hear all about your own pregnancy journey and birth because you were in touch while you were pregnant. You said that you listened to the podcast, and I'm just nosy as hell. Basically, I just want to know how it all went. So tell me, how was your pregnancy first? What brought you to the podcast? What kind of emotional state were you in? I guess what was it like for you?
Yeah, so I would say I had a very positive pregnancy. I actually had found your podcast even before I was pregnant, and I was listening to it for the purpose of learning myself and being able to pass information along to my clients. And then a few months after I became pregnant, and I found the podcast amazing. I would listen to it actually on my commute to and from work. And it was very positive. I didn't actually have any pelvic floor issues. I also, though, before we got pregnant, I did see one of my colleagues who's a pelvic floor physio just to check to make sure everything was in a good place and a good foundation. So I think that really helped. And during pregnancy, I stayed quite active, kept up with going to the gym and doing yoga, different types of activities. I would say near the end, I guess it may be around 36, 37 weeks, I had a little bit of SI, or kind of pelvic pain in the back that kind of was very, kind of didn't last very long. That went away. So yeah, I would say during pregnancy, I didn't really feel held back by what was happening with my body. Emotionally, I would say also going into it, especially with the podcast, and I'm so passionate about birth and about pregnancy. So I had really kind of read everything I could find, went to so many workshops for the benefit of my clients, but then also being pregnant, it was kind of a double bonus with that as well. So I would say definitely going in, I didn't have a ton of fears about birth. And also, I think it helped that anytime I had talked to my mom, or my mom had ever mentioned about my birth, she always talked about it being a very positive experience. And I see how much that can really help women or hinder women if you end up hearing a lot of negative stories, and especially about you being born, that can really manifest internally and come out later. So I think that really helped. Thankful for my mom for introducing it that way. But also being in this line of work, I do see women who've gone through all different birth experiences. So I just wanted to make sure that anything maybe I had internalized and not been aware of, that I was letting that go. So I actually used your fear clearance technique, kind of in the third trimester, just to kind of clear anything that might have been internally and I maybe wasn't even aware of. So thank you for that, because I felt that was very helpful. So I feel like I went into birth feeling I didn't really have fears about it, and just felt also flexible with what may happen, being knowledgeable ahead of time. I felt like it was helpful to be able to make decisions in the process. Mm-hmm.
So how did it all kick off, and how
yeah,
was Pippa early? Was she late? How did it all go?
Yeah, so she came at 41 and 1, so she was a bit after her due date, and I'm pretty sure her due date was pretty accurate, and it was helpful that kind of my midwives weren't pushing me to be like, oh, it's, the date is wrong or whatnot. Like what we thought was the correct date, I felt it was as well. Looking at my cycle. And so usually when we talk about labor and things kick off and they start slow and things are really spaced out, and that did not happen. So in terms of when I was 41 weeks, I had actually had an appointment with my midwives that day. And at that point, I felt comfortable in terms of having a stretch and sweep, just to see if that was going to be helpful or not. And so I had that day. And then I also went to see a pelvic floor physio peer of mine. And what we do is they're very gentle external ligament releases. So for your broad ligament, round ligament, and uterosacral ligament. So she did those on me, and we tend to do those 37 weeks or beyond. And I realized at that point, I'm like, I actually hadn't gone and had anyone do that. So I had her do it that day. On my way home from the clinic, I was on the streetcar and I kind of started to feel some minor cramping, and not having a menstrual cycle in so long, it's amazing your body remembers what that feels like. I felt like I was getting my period, and obviously I wasn't. So that was happening on my way home, and then I got home and I'm like, I'm feeling it. My husband got home from work, and I didn't want to excite him too much, because I know so many women I've worked with are like, things may start and then they stop, and so we didn't want to get our hopes up too much. But then it continued into the evening, and then I really feel like I couldn't just sit down or lie down and rest. Like my body wanted me to get up and move. And they were pretty close. So they started to get a little bit more intense, but still very manageable. And just for curiosity's sake, I was like, let's see how long they last. And in between, and they were about 1 to 2 minutes apart and lasting about 1 to 2 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and that kept going to the evening. So we called our midwives, and I spoke with one of them, and I could still speak. Like everything was very much fine. Like it wasn't near the end yet. So she's like, "We'll try to get some rest." And I really couldn't sleep. So I told my husband, why don't you get some rest? Because if this is it, it's going to be kind of, you'll be up tomorrow. So he went to bed, and I basically throughout the night, and it's amazing how fast it goes. That you really are oblivious to time. So I stayed up all night and basically sat kind of on the couch in between surges, and then would get up, and I went to this specific spot at our kitchen counter, and I just kind of put my hands on it, leaned forward, and I was just swaying my hips for as long as the surge or the contraction would last, and then went and sat back down. And I did that for hours. And then I realized it was probably about 6 a.m. And so I woke up my husband. I'm like, yeah, so I would like someone else to be here with me, just so I'm not, alone. And so he got up. We called our midwives again, and so they came at that time. I also had a doula, so my naturopath is also a doula, so she came, and they checked me early, like I guess 9 or 10 in the morning, and at that point I was 5 centimeters, and the day before when they did the sweep I was 1, so they were pretty happy with their, like, your body's just doing what it needs to do. And we were planning to have a home birth, so we had the birth tub set up in the living room, and we were in Toronto, those who are in Toronto or know, like, condos are not the largest place to live. So we had a small condo, and so we had gotten this kind of mini birth tub. So that was set up, and so that was ready to go. So I was just swaying and doing kind of like the slow dance kind of movement, and that felt really good for quite a while. And my doula sometimes, I had her try like the hip squeezes and kind of the typical things we hear about trying in birth just to help during a contraction or a surge. And my body just didn't really want it. It just wanted to keep moving. So we were doing that for quite a while. And then I guess early afternoon, surges started to space out a little bit more. So my midwives were like, you know what, we'll leave. We'll let you guys just be on your own, just to see if that would change anything. So they went out for a bit, for a couple hours. And then also what my doula did was she actually did acupressure, which was amazing. So it's something I also educate my clients with near the end of pregnancy. And so certain points can actually help almost bring surges back, or for some it can actually help with pain management as well. So she had done some points, and it seemed to bring things back pretty consistently. And then we got back going in terms of kind of the swaying of the hips. And then I got in the birth tub after the midwives came back, and I loved the tub. And I know every woman is very different. I mean, you can prepare as much as you want in terms of different options of what you think you may like. And in the moment, you may not like something that you thought you would. Yeah. But I absolutely loved the tub. So I was definitely in there for a while as well, and pretty relaxed. That my midwives at some points were like, are you having surges? Are these happening? Because you seem super relaxed. And I'm like, no, they're happening, but they're very manageable. And that's actually another thing that I wanted to mention, the fear clearance and the podcast, what was really helpful. And I think even just going into birth, kind of having those fears cleared, is I wouldn't actually say my labor was painful. I would say it was intense. And I know, Alexia, you've mentioned that about your own as well. Yeah. I would say, and it's hard to describe. I'm like, it's an intensity, but I wouldn't actually use the word painful with in terms of the surges and how things were. The only time that actually there was pain was when they did check me. I think it was, when I was 7 and 9 centimeters, and I had a student midwife as well. So she checked first, and then my main midwife would check after, just to confirm what the student had found. And I found when the student checked me, that was actually quite painful. But then when my midwife checked me, I didn't really feel anything. So that being said, those were kind of the only times I felt that. Things continued on. And so it was long. And in terms of my doula was fantastic, making sure I was staying very hydrated. She was making smoothies the whole time for me. Wow. And I even remember as it approached, because everyone had kind of thought I would have given birth at that point by dinner time. And dinner time rolled around. And I remember being aware enough that I kept asking my husband, like, can you order food for everyone else? Because like your midwives are there and everyone's just kind of hanging out. And then, it got to the point that kind of later on in terms of towards the pushing side of things. And so I really liked being in the tubs, but my midwife felt that I was like pretty relaxed in the tub and to maybe try some other positions. So I had gotten out of the tub. I tried some lunging. We tried the birth stool.
Did you say lunging?
Yes, lunging. Yes, yeah. in terms of that. So there's so many different positions. And being a condo, we didn't really have stairs in our condo, but I know a lot of women in their house will end up using that, or in the hospital, having 1 foot up, you can get a foot up on a chair or on the hospital bed as well. We did the birth stool as well. And then in the end, I ended up giving birth on my side on our bed. So that's a position that I often will show clients as well, because you really, being on your back, your tailbone and your sacrum don't get the ability to move kind of out of the way in a way as the baby's coming down the canal. So I had told my midwives I really didn't want to be in that position. And so I ended up being on my side, and my husband was holding my top leg, and my doula was kind of eye level with me. So I gave birth to her in sideline. And I mean, the amazing part too at the end is the midwives, they asked in terms of how we would like in terms of the end part to go, in terms of, would my husband guide the baby out? Would I guide the baby out? Did I want them to do it? And I said, if it's possible, I would love to do it. So as she was crowning, and they're like, you can reach down and feel her head, which I did, which was amazing. And then, in terms of as she came out, I got to pick her up. They weren't even, they were there obviously watching and guiding and watching for any medical concerns. But I actually got to reach down and as she came out and pull her on my chest. And it was just absolutely amazing feeling at that point. And you just have no idea. Time went by. I mean, it was long, but you have no concept at that point. And thankfully I stayed very hydrated and nourished throughout the process. So that was my birth experience.
Wow.
And I mean, like I've said before, in terms of, we were very aware before planning with the home birth, knowing, having that, if something were to happen, knowing what hospital we were going to go to, have a plan with that. We did a hospital tour. So we were very well aware that if our midwives felt like, it's time to go, we should be going, that we were open to that. But it ended up that we were able to give birth at home as we had hoped. So
Brilliant. So when was that then? How long? I'm just thinking you must have been up for a good couple of days.
It was a lot. Well, it was, so I guess the kind of cramping had started the Thursday night. So at 6 p.m. And then I gave birth at almost midnight the next day.
Okay.
So, so the one night I didn't get to sleep. Thankfully, though, during pregnancy, I actually didn't have any sleep issues, which I'm very thankful for, because I think I would have been even more exhausted if I hadn't been sleeping the nights before. But it was kind of the one night and up all day. Brilliant.
No, that sounds wonderful. And you use the fear clearance method. So that's brilliant. I'm curious, what fears would you be able to share what you worked on? What fears did you work on?
Yeah, totally. So I would say in terms of, I did want to clear kind of the idea of being fearful of pain with that. So I cleared that. And then also even tearing, because I do see women with all variations of tearing. And that was just something I'm like, I don't know if that's internalized, and it is a very common fear. So I had cleared that as well. I think those were the two main, and then even, the other part too, which I know you've mentioned before, is even just like, you don't know what you're going to do in labor. Like, I remember telling my husband, like, I don't know how I'm going to act. I'm not sure really what's going to happen, because you're kind of in your primal brain. So I guess that idea of like, I don't know what I'm going to do. So just kind of clearing the fear of like letting my body do whatever it needs to do during that process. So I'd say those were probably the top three.
Yeah, and I think that the fear of pain, I think, is such an important one, and it's interesting how I think because we have a fear of it, then we're probably more likely to bring it on, but also then because the experiences that you have when you're in labour, they're not really pain, it's just intense. But when we have that fear of it, we label it as pain. And we're more likely to then repeat that and therefore create pain. So I think working on a fear of pain is just so useful. So it's really interesting that you worked on that, and then you didn't really feel that you experienced it at all. And actually, it's when there was a student midwife doing stuff, and that's probably down to her skill level rather than birth.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, and also the kind of the ring of fire, which is so
Oh yeah, that was
commonly mentioned as well. And I told her, I'm like, I did not feel that. I did not feel her crowning. I didn't feel in terms of pain with any of that. So I
wow.
think that also helped with it.
Amazing, amazing. Now I'm really curious. I'm kind of like curious about all the pelvic stuff now because
Yeah.
you mentioned before you were pregnant, you went for a checkup. You
Yes.
mentioned then that thing that you do from 37 weeks. So I'm like, oh
Yeah.
no, there's stuff you can do before you're pregnant. Like, okay, so I want to hear all about. So
Yeah.
tell me about the stuff pre-pregnancy then. In terms of checking your
Yeah.
floor.
Yeah. So with that, I mean, definitely, I do see actually a lot of women who may not be planning ever on having children, or just are not at the point where they are going to have children. But you can have pelvic floor issues, you can have leaking, and pelvic pain can be common. But even if you don't have any of that, even just going for an assessment. So basically, in terms of, it's similar to seeing a physio who doesn't do internal. So we do, a detailed history about health and injuries, your goals and concerns, looking at posture, looking at your core muscles from the outside. But then internally, so assessing your pelvic floor internally is really the gold standard to know how your pelvic floor is functioning. And so basically just checking to make sure that your muscles aren't too tight, because it tends to be, before having children, I would say tightness is more the issue. It's very rare that things will be very loose. So you want to make sure that you're, almost think of your pelvic floor, that if you think of ground level, you don't want it to be too tight. So you don't want to be on level 2 or level 3 in terms of that. So we want to relax the pelvis so we can go down to kind of 0 with that. So I'd say that's the common issue before, is learning actually how to relax your pelvic floor, and then learning how to engage it and also release it. Because the common thing with kegels is women often just tighten, tighten, tighten. And really a true contraction of any muscle is actually contraction or activation, a bit of a tightening, but then also a release. So it goes back to what we call like resting state. So that can be really helpful before getting pregnant. So that's what I had gone for. And
Okay.
I actually had tightness in some of the pelvic floor muscles on the right side of my pelvis, which I wasn't too surprised, because growing up as a ballet dancer and an athlete, I actually remember having right side, like it would exhibit as right hip discomfort with certain things, especially if I did long distance running. My right hip by the end would be sore. And you can actually, the pelvic floor muscles can actually refer to spots in your hip, in your low back, your groin, your inner thigh. So I really think that I probably had that tightness for years before, but never really knew about it until I had that internal, before even thinking about getting pregnant.
So I'm thinking that, in my head, I'm thinking, surely if you're somebody that exercises a lot, if you're somebody that
Yeah.
is generally fit, then does that mean that your pelvic floor is more likely to be, I mean, can you have a fit pelvic floor in that sense? Is that,
Yeah. Interesting enough, I would actually say a lot of women I see, if they're really active and really athletic before, that tightness can actually play a role, because so in so many activities, and I even think back to my dance background, like we're often told, tighten your core, tighten your glutes and everything. So some sports, you may actually be have been taught to tighten all through the years. So then when you do have an internal, I often do see that there's actually a tightness in the pelvic floor.
So actually what you need to do is then learn to relax it more and learn to disengage
Yes.
it more. Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
disengage it. And then once that happens, then we want to balance it. So we want to make sure that it can, tighten depending on what the specific activity you're doing, and then also release as well, so that it's just like any other muscle and can do both.
Okay, so then let's fast forward to the bit in pregnancy then that you said. Was it from 37 weeks you said there was a thing? So tell me more about that. What's that about?
Yeah, so that technique at 37 weeks they're very gentle external techniques, and basically we're looking at the round ligament, broad ligament, and uterosacral ligament, and we just want to make sure that there's symmetry between them, and to make sure that there isn't too much tension. So sometimes an asymmetry with them can basically mean that one side is tighter, and because of where those ligaments attach, that can affect how symmetrical your pelvis is, and that can affect how the baby moves down the canal. So a big part throughout pregnancy. So I'll see women even kind of as early as the first trimester. And something that we work on throughout, especially the third trimester, is that symmetry in the pelvis. Because if we can create that, that also creates a more optimal environment for the baby to move down well. Because sometimes even stalling during labor can be a sign that maybe things aren't quite as symmetrical as they could, or things are tight. So that's another reason to address a tight pelvic floor. If women learn how to release it, and then we talk about cues and visualization to release your pelvic floor during labor and during kind of the pushing phase, that can greatly help as well. So we start all of that in pregnancy, so then when it comes to labor, it's not a big surprise.
So actually you can do, there's quite a lot of pelvic floor prep then that you can do during pregnancy to basically help you to make sure the birth canal is, you know, all aligned, all balanced, all straightened out, and you're used to using those muscles, and that stuff you can do during pregnancy. So brilliant. Okay, how often then, if somebody was going to really, you know, be completely into the whole pelvic floor prep thing, how often would they need to go and see somebody like you during pregnancy?
Right. And you know what, it depends also, because some women who may be going into pregnancy who already have children can be going into pregnancy with issues already. So I do see a lot of those women who are, you know, leaking, or their diastasis, that ab separation, didn't fully heal after subsequent births. So that's something I may see them more to address those particular issues. But someone going into their first pregnancy who maybe doesn't have any symptoms, I would see them less, because it's more about preventing symptoms from coming on and then preparing for birth. So it's really hard. It's hard to say. But I always tell women it's never too early, but it's also never too late. So I've even seen women who, for the first time, they're seeing me at 37, 38 weeks. So I may only get to see them once before birth, but there's definitely a lot of information and a lot of education that I can provide them to make that birth a even more positive experience, and as well help with their postpartum recovery. So that's another big aspect. If you go during pregnancy, you're much more prepared for efficiently recovering afterwards, especially in that initial part.
And I've seen some incredible photos on Facebook, where women have gone to see somebody about their pelvic floor and their posture, and how it really changes how their bump appears. You know, like the side-on photos, where just having that realignment can really help them to carry themselves better and be a lot more comfortable in pregnancy. So are those some of the things you would help people with as well? Yes.
Yeah. Alignment is huge. I would say alignment is probably even the most important part, because if we don't know how to kind of align our body or place our body in a great position, then our pelvic floor, but our entire core doesn't necessarily have the easiest time activating to support ourselves. So you could do all the core work in the world you want, but then if you're going about your day with poor posture, poor alignment, then you won't necessarily get the benefit of it. And with pregnancy, I mean, there's so many changes as your belly grows, your base of support starts to shift, right? And then your body is very smart and figures out, how can I compensate to support this, you know, growing belly, growing chest. There's hormones that are changing. So if we can create that wonderful alignment in pregnancy, that also can help afterwards. Because once the baby comes out, our body doesn't just all of a sudden remember, oh, I should, you know, go back to this posture that I was in before pregnancy. And for some women, it wasn't great before pregnancy. So even with that, it's not the most helpful. So having those tips during pregnancy can totally change how the postpartum recovery is as well.
Now, I in my second pregnancy, I had SPD, or pelvic girdle distress. Is it something? I don't know what the SPD stands for. Is it the same thing? They're both the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah. So pubic symphysis dysfunction. It's and there's a few words for it, and it's that. So did you have the pain in the front of your pelvis?
I had it on my. It was on my. It really hit the side of my thigh. I'm just pointing. Obviously, nobody can see this. But I'm pointing to the side of my thigh. I could feel it, like my pelvic bone area was clicking as I walked, and it was absolute agony.
Yes.
And when I obviously what every pregnant woman does when she has any kind of symptom, I Googled it, which was a big mistake. And it was quite late in my pregnancy. I'd say maybe 36, maybe 35. I don't know, that kind of time. And it was awful because I read it and they went, "Oh, that's it. You're stuck like this till the birth. Nothing can be done, and it'll be like this after the birth." And it just, obviously, you read it and you think, oh my goodness, I literally couldn't even walk to the toilet. And I could hear it clicking, and it was really quite horrid. And I was immobilised, I'd say, for a couple of days until I decided I was going to sort it out. So, but I ended up sorting it out with my head trash clearance method, actually.
Wonderful.
And I ended up, and another method, I thought, I'm going to work on the emotion that might be blocking me from being in a healthy place. And I was amazed. I worked on it at night. In the morning I woke up and it was all gone, and I was like, wow, never, and that's really fascinating to me why my body was able to do that. And apparently the whole stress about how that affects your muscle and your emotions around what you're experiencing can really impact your body in that way. Does that kind of, when you're hearing me say that, you're thinking that sounds crazy, or does that make sense to you?
It totally makes sense. So you're really going into, which is wonderful, and that's pelvic girdle pain can come out in so many ways, and so it's anything kind of involving the pelvis. And I see it all the time, and so I do incorporate that a lot, the mind-body connection, because it is really amazing how our brain affects how our body feels, including pain, but also even in terms of symptoms, that it can really change. So if we only address the physical side, often there's a bit of a missing piece. So I do talk a lot about addressing the nervous system, basically, can really greatly affect in terms of pain. So that's exactly what happened to you, which is amazing. So I don't think it's weird or anything. It's very, very relevant. And there's so much pain science research now. So even not necessarily to do with pregnancy, but pain in general. Just the mind-body connection is so key in really addressing concerns and symptoms.
Well, pain, there's a lot of research that I've been reading, which I'm sure you're familiar with all of it and more, is around how pain is such a mental construct and how different people's experiences of pain, one person might find one thing painful and the other one doesn't. So it really is a mindset thing. And I think by going in there first, you can only it helps you to support your body in that healing process, or in its own realignment, in getting back to a good place. So my first protocol now is always, what's the hidden emotion, what's going on here, work on that first, and then support the body afterwards. So but that's because it's my skill set, whereas you would have that and you'd go straight in for the physio piece and doing all that kind of work. Somebody has got pelvic girdle distress or whatever, all the other names they've got. What's the best thing that, because it is absolutely, it's awful, it's really painful, I couldn't even go to the toilet, and what can a woman do? Is it best to book in with a session with somebody like you? What else can she do?
No, it can be great if you can see a physio who does work with women in terms of pre and postpartum. But in terms of, because a lot of it can be positioning as well. So kind of even going back to the symmetry of the pelvis, and it can happen to even as baby, especially late in pregnancy like that. The baby is shifting and could, be pressing on a certain area, or even how you were moving, or maybe picking something up and something in terms of tweaked a little bit with that. And then your body goes into that kind of shock state. So definitely, I would say if you can get in to see someone, because they can take a look at your alignment and really try to create that symmetry again. So that can be a wonderful idea. Also, the fear clearance that you mentioned. So it could be in terms of, if some event happened that was very stressful, sometimes that can manifest in our body as well, how you mentioned. But also even the simplest thing is deep breathing. It's really amazing how deep breathing is very connected to our nervous system, and that idea of that fight or flight response that we end up tightening up. So if we bring up the other side of our nervous system, the parasympathetic, so the deep breathing can actually help relax that area. So for some women that I see, I will have initially seen them, we've worked on their pelvic floor, maybe they were tight and we've released that and we've, started strengthening and have gone on. But then some stressful event, whether physically or emotionally happens, pain comes on and I check them and their pelvic floor has actually tightened up at that point. So then we go back to the release work. So, so definitely in terms of learning to relax the body could actually affect the pain that's happening as well.
Now, another thing you've mentioned is the diastasis. Have I said that right? I don't know if I've said that
diastasis,
right.
Diastasis,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, yeah. I remember this came up again with my second pregnancy. I think it's just because I was pretty old by the time I did it the second time around. But and I took a while to heal. So let's just talk a little bit about what that is, so that anyone listening goes, what is she talking about? Just kind of explain
I know,
it's a bit more.
Bit of a funny word. So, and there's diastasis recti. There's kind of a few different words with it. But it's referring to a separation of your left and right, if you think of your six-pack muscles, abdominal muscles that are kind of on the surface, and that they end up sitting farther apart. So it's not that a hernia would be that there's actually a cut through. So this is not that. This is more of a separation. So the tissue that connects the left and right abs stretches. And it's so common during pregnancy. And depending what research you look at, some even say 100% within the third trimester will experience this. So it is a very natural part of pregnancy because it makes sense. Our body has to make space for this baby. The issue can come about is if our core muscles can't necessarily contract to support that this new change is going on. And then sometimes things can happen in terms of pain or leaking. Those things can sometimes go together, but not always. So the actual diastasis is that separation. And some women, you may even notice if you're doing kind of a sit-up or crunch type movement and you see almost like a coning or a doming along the center of your abs, that can be a sign that it's happening. With that, especially during pregnancy, you may see the doming. Afterwards, you may see that as well, or you may feel kind of a gap between the left and right abs when you're lying on your back or even in standing. So that's really what the diastasis is. Yeah. And there can be, in terms of afterwards, those first 8 weeks after birth, there can be, in terms of some spontaneous healing in that area. And sometimes beyond that, women need a little bit more guidance in terms of how to use their core muscles to help recover or heal that area. So every woman is a little bit different in how that area heals, but even how the diastasis develops in pregnancy. So there's so much variation. We look at typically above the belly button, at the belly button, and below. So some women will have that separation all three spots. Some women will only have it in one. Generally around the belly button is the most prominent part, just because that's where we tend to grow the most. So yeah, there's so many variations. And for some women, it can be, it can contribute to some issues, and for other women, it doesn't. And so getting that assessed can be helpful, because then that can help even guide types of exercises during pregnancy that may be the most beneficial for you, and then also afterwards.
So what about then exercise during pregnancy? You know, they get all those Instagram shots of women in the gym at 39 weeks and then everything in uproar and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of, is there anything we can do during pregnancy to try and minimise that from going a bit pear-shaped, as it were, or can kind of restrict, support your healing journey on the other side? Is there anything you can do?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things to do is, even if any of those movements, so often that sit-up or crunch movement, if you notice the doming, it could be something to avoid, basically activities that you're seeing that happening. So where you're getting symptoms, avoiding those at the time. But also learning how to engage your deep core. So your pelvic floor, your TA, your transverse abdominis, which is like this deep corset muscle, your diaphragm as well that sits on top. So those are kind of three of your really deep core muscles. And we have these little tiny muscles multifidus along your spine as well, which can be a part of that group. And so learning how to activate those together to support your body in whatever activities that you're looking to continue with. So again, it's one of those things that it's very difficult to make kind of a blanket statement of like, only do this, don't do this. Because I really feel that women should be able to do activities at like their goals. So some women, want to be lifting weights. Other women want to be doing yoga. So really in terms of seeing a physio can be helpful, because then we can, assess what your body is at that time and just help guide you to do those activities with the best support possible. And going back to that idea of the pelvic floor could be tight, So for a woman who has a tight pelvic floor versus a woman who does not, that might change what you end up doing during pregnancy as well, just to address those if they are concerns of yours.
Yeah. Okay. And so now let's talk post-pregnancy then, in terms of getting the pelvic floor back on track. Mine still needs to go back on track.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you said earlier that it's never too late. So I'm really interested. But certainly for those that really are on it and really sensible and do stuff, and I know that in France, the government pay for women to receive treatment on their pelvic floor pretty much straight after pregnancy. And so French women are very, very lucky here. And it'd be great if all women could be offered that, but they can't. So here we are. So what can a woman do to help get her pelvic floor back to where it was post-pregnancy, like straight away? Like, what are those first things she can do?
So initially, what you really want to do is actually very gentle exercises. So what we end up talking about, especially if you've had any sort of tearing, so an episiotomy or vaginal like natural tearing, is that you actually want to do a bit of going back to that idea of release work, because what can happen is your muscles from the stitches, the area can actually tense up or kind of guard the area and things get tense. And then we try to go back to exercise that our muscles are trying to tighten again, but they're already tight. So that idea of even doing, again, going back to that breath work, really getting your diaphragm to work again, so then it gives your pelvic floor a better option to work with it. And so we do deep breathing. The visualization I often use actually to release the pelvic floor is you want to think of a flower blooming out of the bottom of your pelvis. So basically out of your vagina. It sounds really funny, but it works really well. And so anytime I tell a client to do it and they kind of laugh, but when pelvic floor physio, if they're feeling internally, more often than not, we actually feel those muscles relax. So a lot of women I see after birth that have pain from tearing, we actually work on that initially before any sort of strengthening. That helps to release it. And that's also a breath to use during labor and birth. So I'd even say starting with that breath. And then working on, again, alignment. That alignment is so key. So something really important is stacking your ribs over your pelvis. And Julie Wiebe, who's a wonderful physio out of the US, she talks about that a lot. So really trying to get your ribs stacked over your pelvis, because then your diaphragm and your pelvic floor and that TA, that corset muscle around the middle, has the best option of working well. So that's, I'd say, what you actually want to start with. And then you would do some gradual strengthening of the pelvic floor and that whole system, and then gradually getting back to other activities. So oftentimes women are given, I'm not sure if everywhere it's the same. I know here in Canada and the US, usually there's this 6-week appointment with your care provider. So whether it's your obstetrician, your GP, your midwife, and often women wait for that 6 weeks to get what we call the green light to go back to activity. And then oftentimes women kind of go back to doing, heavy weights or jumping or running or that at that time. And it can be a better idea just to make sure that your alignment, because again, your baby came out and your body doesn't naturally go back. If you remember, Alexia, I remember after everything is just mush. Yeah. Like regardless of what you do during pregnancy for core, your center is mushy. So you want to make sure that foundation is really set first, and then gradually getting back to other activities that you really want to get back to. So the key things, especially those first, 6 to 8 weeks, alignment and getting that deep foundation to work again. So if you do have the option to see women's health or pelvic health physio, they can help set you up for that as well. But if not, then working on, the breath work and alignment is really key.
Now, are there any other exercises other than the really, really boring ones of just sitting there clenching and releasing at various tempos that you can do? Because I used to do martial art. I love doing crunches. I love doing stuff where I feel like I'm doing something. Yeah. What other exercises can we do other than the kind of, maybe we should talk about the little clenching one first, because obviously that's a really good one. But I just got so bored with that. I never did it. And that's why I didn't do it, I think. If somebody said to me, just do 20 crunches every day, this one, I probably would have done that. I need it to be a bit more exciting. I'm not exciting. So what can we do then? If we're at home, is there anything we can do?
Yeah, so the idea and I know the clenching one, the kegels that you're talking about, right? And it's so true that now more the shift is towards, and how I often will teach women is that we want to find our pelvic floor, but then also again with that TA and with the diaphragm. So we end up doing breath work with those exercises. So not just isolating the pelvic floor, but getting the rest working. And initially we start lying down, but once women are able to get an activation that way, then we're up right away. So then we start moving to sitting, to standing, to bring that activation into squats, into lunges, into bridges. So really a lot of exercises you would do in a lot of different activities. So whether you go to the gym or whether you go to yoga, so even things like chaturanga in terms of plank, we bring in that deep core activation into that. So really, so traditionally it's been that we have these kind of core exercises, but I like to more think about bringing that deep core support into whatever exercise or activity you're doing. So really that's more what it's about. So once you're able to get those initial activations, then carrying it into your goals, your other aspects or other activities you'd like to get back into. So that being said, again, with every woman, it's a bit different. So getting that deep foundation first and then building it into your other exercises or exercises leading up to them. So women who want to run, oftentimes once they get that deep core activation on their back, then we're moving to standing, we're moving to lunge work, we're moving to standing on one leg work and moving forward that way. And then making sure, again, when they're running, that they have that really great rib over pelvis alignment, so then they can really get their deep core during those movements.
So what about then, like for me now that's left it a little bit long, two years and counting since what should I be doing? What can I do? And what can other women like me, and even women that have left it much longer, what can they do now to rescue the situation and go trampolining again if that's their wish?
Yeah. So in terms of, again, getting that deep foundation again, learning how to activate that. And then for trampolining, you'd want to be able to learn to activate that. So you would use your exhale to engage, inhale, release. You want to be able to do that when you're doing squats. And so, because that would be kind of a close idea to when you're jumping on a trampoline, doing 1 foot work and that as well, doing lunge work. So learning how to activate those muscles when you're standing and when you're moving while you're standing to get you back, and kind of that quick, we almost call it rebounding. So it'd be quick movements of your core, because that's what happens when you're jumping on the trampoline. So it's just your deep core needs to learn how to accommodate for the forces that are happening when you're on a trampoline, because when you're jumping, right, everything's going down. And then as you lift, if things are still lowering, then you're going to get that leaking with it. So it's just about re-educating that deep core for that specific task. So definitely I would recommend seeing a physio in your area just to get that assessed, and they'll be able to guide you how to activate to be able to get back to that.
So
it's so common.
And what I'm hearing really is it's basically, as long as you're doing core work, your pelvic floor will benefit. So whereas I was under the impression that I needed to do the kegels, and it was basically quite an isolated exercise, whereas actually it sounds from what you're saying, as long as you're doing core exercises, so the plank, the crunches, the squats, the lunges, all that kind of stuff, you'll be supporting your pelvic floor by doing that, by working on the muscles around it anyway. Have I got that right?
In a way, yeah. So it would be a matter of making sure, though, that your pelvic floor is working properly during those movements, because sometimes what happens is a lot of the superficial muscles, or there's other muscles compensating for your pelvic floor. So initially with some women, we really get them to find their pelvic floor on its own, but often it's that the diaphragm with the pelvic floor, we really need that relationship, and then building it into those other types of core exercises. Because if you just do the other ones without knowing what your pelvic floor is doing or getting it to work with you, then those symptoms may still persist. But you're exactly right in terms of it shouldn't just be thought of, I just got to, lie on my back and do these like isolated Kegel exercises, because just doing that alone won't necessarily give you the results that you're looking for. So, and it also, I totally understand, can be boring in terms of that. So once those muscles know how to activate, we want to get you moving and get you to more exciting and creative movements and get you back to your goals.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
yeah.
Brilliant. Now, what about, what's your view on that? I heard about a Kegel exercise equipment, for want of a better word, which is basically looks like it looks like a tampon with weights on it that you can use. Have you heard of that? And are they a good idea?
Yeah. So there are so many, and I feel like, again, social media, like every day I'm coming on, and I guess maybe just because of what I post and what I'm interested in, I end up seeing all these new kind of machines and things coming on the market. And so what you're talking about could be weights in terms of, like a vaginal weight. And some recommend. I'm not the biggest fan of it, because when you have something like that in, the idea is your pelvic floor is basically clenching to hold the tampon in, so to not let it fall out. And it doesn't seem to be the most functional way. Like, that's not really how our pelvic floor works during the day. So depending what activity we're doing. So if we're walking, our pelvic floor has to activate to a certain degree, and it doesn't actually stay stationary. It's hovering in certain levels of activation. And then if we go down and, pick up our child, then it has to do a different type of activation. So throughout the day, it's constantly changing, just like any other muscle in our body. So it's not like our quadricep or our thigh is constantly clenching the same amount all day. So the same thing goes with our pelvic floor. So just to me, it doesn't make the most sense in terms of training those muscles, because that's not really how we work. Plus, with that, it's not addressing, again, the diaphragm, that core. It's not addressing the other muscles that need to work with the pelvic floor. Yeah. So I'm not the biggest fan of that. I know some people do get that recommended, and some people may have results with that, and that's great. Yeah. It's just not something I tend to use in my practice.
No, it does sound a bit gimmicky, actually, but I think it's great for getting headlines, that's for sure. Yes. Now, I'm just wondering, one thing I didn't ask about was obviously trampolining, which isn't the thing that everybody's that worried about. It's just I got caught out quite badly when I wanted to go. It's sneezing and laughing. So what about? I mean, we haven't talked about sneezing and laughing. All this stuff. Is there something different that's going on when you let a bit out if you've laughed or sneezed, or is that the same?
Yeah, no. So again, there could be a tightness in the pelvic floor. Sometimes that's the case. So then the pelvic floor can't activate properly to address. When we cough or sneeze, we get pressure in our abdomen. And you may even notice when you cough or sneeze, you might see it push out. You might see it draw in. So what happens is there may be a weakness in the pelvic floor, but also a timing issue. So there's a reflex that we have that your pelvic floor should come on just before you cough or sneeze, or land from a jump or trampoline as well. And sometimes that gets lost, and that can happen pregnancy, birth. It can happen to women, again, who don't have children. And what we want to do is get that coordination back. So it's not only about getting the pelvic floor and that deep core system to activate, but it's the timing of it. So for those women, what I'll often have them do is, when we get to the point of learning how to activate their pelvic floor with everything else, I have them try it. So when I'm internally feeling their pelvic floor muscles, I'll have them contract their pelvic floor really quickly, and then do a fake cough. And basically from that, they're teaching themselves how to get that reflex back. So I don't necessarily have them practice that at home. But if they're going to cough or sneeze, we've worked on it, and they're aware of how to activate quickly before, instead of crossing their legs or holding the wall. Everyone just kind of stops and braces. And you want to get to the point that you could walk down the street, right, and not have to stop to sneeze or cough. So that's really what it's about. So the activation that I've been talking about, kind of one of the cues, there's so many different cues, but it's when we exhale, if you picture, so a blueberry or a marble, something small at your vaginal opening and rectal opening, you're thinking as you exhale that you're actually drawing both of those up and in. And so that's the idea if you were to cough or sneeze, you want to think of drawing those up and in really quickly, and then you would cough or sneeze. And so many women I see, it's actually a pretty quick change and resolving of that issue when we're ready to strengthen. So as long as there's no tightness, we start to bring that quick activation in, and often it's resolved fairly quickly. with that. They just want to make sure afterwards you don't stay tight and keep those lifted. You want to, again, go back to that release work. So even trying that out, you may even notice a difference. And as a pelvic physio, we have so many cues. So for some women, that idea of lifting a blueberry or a marble or a bean or something doesn't get the muscles to work as well. Sometimes I talk about, you think of a straw and a milkshake, drawing a milkshake up and in. You can think of a jellyfish, drawing a jellyfish up and in. Like, there's so many cues and they sound so funny. But it goes back to that mind-body connection, right? That idea of what you visualize actually can help change what your muscles actually do. So that's how we resolve the coughing and sneezing, is often that technique.
Brilliant. Well, there's been so much. You've shared so much. This is brilliant. I'm just wondering, is there anything that you haven't said that you think a pregnant woman needs to hear as she goes into birth, that you think, I still haven't talked about this? Is there anything I've missed?
I would say the only thing would be is kind of the common or the traditional idea out there is to do tons of kegels while you're pregnant to help in terms of with pregnancy, with birth, and afterwards. And I would say the biggest thing going into birth is, again, that pelvic symmetry, but also learning to release your pelvic floor. Because when it comes to birth, if all you know how to do is tighten, that baby is coming out. Whether it's vaginally or through a cesarean birth, that baby is coming out. So if all your body knows how to intuitively do is tighten, that's really not going to help with birth. So learning actually how to release, regardless of what you're going into birth with, I think is really that key part. So that flower bloom breath that I mentioned, doing that going into birth in various positions. So some women do it in a really deep squat. And even some of the amazing positions you can do with a birth ball. So if you're on hands and knees, resting your body over the ball, sitting on the ball, but even just sitting in general with the legs apart, the symmetry and releasing your pelvic floor, I can't emphasize enough, is so beneficial going into birth. So.
Brilliant. Well, Anita, it's been absolutely brilliant chatting to you. I've been so pleased we finally got you on the podcast.
Yes,
it's been brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, if anyone is in your, you still in Toronto? Is that where you are?
No, so I'm just north of Toronto in a smaller city called Peterborough. So it's just a couple hours north of Toronto.
Okay, so if anybody is in Peterborough, we've got a Peterborough here in the UK that's not far from me, actually.
Yes. I know, anytime if you look up on the internet, both the UK and Ontario.
So I'm not far from that one either. So, but if anyone is in the Canadian Peterborough that wants to check you out, come and say hi, get a session with you, where can they find you online?
Yes. So in terms of, so my website is www.holistichealthphysio.com. You can also find me on Facebook or Instagram at Holistic Health Physio, or on Twitter at Holistic Physio.
Brilliant. Well, thank you once more, Anita, for coming on the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Alexia, for all that you do, and for having a third session in terms of episodes, because it's helped myself, but so many women. So thank you for doing what you do.
Now, wasn't Anita brilliant? She was just so articulate and explained it all so brilliantly and clearly. So anyway, I hope that was useful for you. Now, I just wanted to recap the offer that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, because Anita did mention that she used the head trash clearance method, and maybe you're thinking, oh, actually, yes, I'd like to do that too. So if you do want to use the head trash clearance method, I'm doing a 50% discount only this weekend off the course. So if you're going to take action, do it. It's because of the whole Mother's Day thing that I explained at the beginning. So if you want to do that, then check out the email that I'll be sending out on Friday. So you just need to join the Fear-Free Childbirth list at the fearfreechildbirth.com website on the homepage, and then you will be able to find out details of the discount. Okay, bye for now. You've just been listening to me, Alexia Leachman, here on the Fear-Free Childbirth podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now, this is just a wee reminder that if you'd like to listen to bonus podcast episodes and have access to loads of birth preparation downloads, my video mini-series on reducing your fears, and so much more, then join the Fearless Mumship community today. You can join at fearfreechildbirth.com. Until next time, bye for now.